In Matthew chapter 4, when Jesus is being tempted by Satan in the wilderness,
Mm-hmm.
and the devil, he takes Jesus up to the top of the temple and says, "If you're the Son of God, throw yourself down." That's a terrible example. I'm sorry. I'm taking a passage where the devil quotes scripture, and
Maybe that's not the best way to go on.
Pistols, prayer, and potluck. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Hi, folks. Welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio, a show about guns, hunting, competitive shooting, the natural right of self-defense, and what God's Word says about the issues surrounding gun rights and gun ownership. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran, and this is episode number 193. Thank you so much for making Armed Lutheran Radio a part of your week. We're joined again by the pistol-packing padre himself, Pastor John Bennett from St. John's Lutheran Church in Willow Creek, Minnesota. Pastor, welcome back. It's good to be back with you.
it is good to be back with you as well, since we both managed to be somewhat healthy at this moment in time. Not sounding like we've got frogs stuck in our throat.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for filling in last week. You did an excellent job as always.
I don't know if you'd say excellent. Like, it was, you go to bat when you're in a ball game, and I think I got hit by the pitch on that one and made it to base, so.
Well, it drove a run home, so that's good. We'll take it.
And to our listeners, I'm sorry I didn't have anything profound to share with you. I have been prayerfully considering a call to a congregation about 3-4 hours north of here, so
Right.
my mind was other places. I almost forgot to record the audio for last week's episode, so it's purely by the grace of God that you had my voice. Well, I don't know if that's the grace of God that you had my voice to listen to, but you had something.
Well, we're talking about the first article of the Creed today, so then we can give thanks for your voice as well. That's
Well, I appreciate you saying so.
and that is our topic today. The first article of the Apostles' Creed. This topic is inspired again by my daughter's confirmation classes. She is in the first year of confirmation. They are starting to review the Apostles' Creed. And what got me thinking about this was reading through Luther's explanation with her and the idea of God's promise to protect us from all evil and from harm, and how that relates to self-defense and gun rights. We'll get into that in just a moment, but first, I want to thank all of you who support the show. Armed Lutheran Radio is listener-funded, and that means that we rely on the support of our listeners to keep this thing going, and especially those of you who are members of the Reformation Gun Club, people like Kathy and Calroy and Jeremy and James and Tyler and Brian and Paul, good people who value what we do here enough to support us financially. If you would be interested in joining them and finding out about all the benefits of membership, you get access to hundreds of hours of exclusive content, some cool Armed Lutheran swag. You get to hang out with the cast once a month in our online hangouts, and you get the satisfaction of knowing you're helping to keep all this going. If you would like to find out more, check it out at armedlutheran.us/gun club. All right, we are talking about the first article of the Apostles' Creed. The Creed is a statement of faith that dates, for those who are not familiar, dates back to the fourth century?
Some think it dates earlier than that. The reason that it's referred to as the Apostles' Creed is because it contains doctrine that was taught by the apostles, who, of course, learned from Christ Jesus himself. There are 12, even though as Lutherans we have it broken into the three articles for each person of the Trinity. There's 12 statements, you could say, within the Apostles' Creed. So they said, well, there was one from each of the apostles. Don't know which one was from Judas, but
Right.
just a little bit of New Testament trivia for you. Matthias replaced Judas, so there you have it.
Okay.
But it seems to mirror some similar statements of faith that are recorded by St. Paul. So some think that it's within the 1st century, certainly by the 3rd, 4th century. I'd say we could safely date it at least within the 3rd century.
Gotcha. Okay. It's first, I think, referred to sort of by name as the Creed of the Apostles, but I think in a letter from St. Ambrose in the 4th century, somewhere around 390. So obviously it predates that. Right. The first article of the Creed is, and you just mentioned the 3 articles that, as Luther broke it down, each article referring to or describing one of the persons of the Godhead, and the first article being about God the Father and creation. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. It's one simple sentence. It's all comprehensive, but Luther goes a little further and, as is his wont, explains it in greater detail. Pastor, can you give us the explanation?
Yes. What does this mean? I believe that God has made me and all creatures, that He has given me my body and soul, eyes, ears, and all my members, my reason and all my senses, and still takes care of them. He also gives me clothing and shoes, food and drink, house and home, wife and children, land, animals, and all I have. He richly and daily provides me with all that I need to support this body and life. He defends me against all danger and guards and protects me from all evil. All this He does only out of fatherly divine goodness and mercy, without any merit or worthiness in me. For all this it is my duty to thank and praise, serve and obey Him. This is most certainly true.
All right, so I want to focus on that sentence. He defends me against all danger and guards and protects me from all evil. That sentence, I guess, jumped out at me when we were reading through it and got me thinking about this subject, and it brought up, I think, 3 questions that we see both in the gun debate and in discussions of faith. And I thought we would go through those this morning and discuss those a little bit in reverse order of difficulty. The first one, I think, is the one that we've addressed at various times in the past, and it usually comes from the anti-gun side of the gun debate, and that is, if you have faith, if you believe that this statement is correct, that God defends us, that God actively protects us from evil and danger, why do you need a gun?
Well, one of my favorite Luther quotes, and I've said this before, is that no one sits on his couch with an open mouth and expects a roasted chicken to fly into it. I'm grossly paraphrasing there. That's not the exact quote word for word, but that in essence is what Luther says. And what I mean by that, why I'm prefacing my comments with that, is that our God defends us through various means. And we could take a look at Romans 13, where it talks about the civil authorities that have been put in place for our good. Part of that is our protection, to reward those who do good, to punish those who do evil. Mm-hmm. That's one of the means, quote unquote, that our God uses to defend us.
Right.
He also grants us a rational human mind that we can recognize danger and flee from it. And He also gives us the ability to defend ourselves, if necessary, with force. I don't think Luther would have ever argued that, if you have a band of thieves breaking into your house that are armed and ready to do harm to you, that you are just to sit there and do nothing because God's going to defend you.
Right.
Hey, dummy, go get that kitchen knife and defend yourself.
Right.
It's so, in other words, what we could say is that, yes, God has promised to protect us, He protects us because we are his creation. He has created us in his own image. If we look at, for example, Matthew chapter 6, if our God takes care of the birds of the air and the flowers of the field and so forth, isn't he also going to take care of you? But our God, of course, he uses various means. We don't sit around doing absolutely nothing saying, yeah, God's promised to take care of me. You wonder then why you end up being evicted and homeless and starving to death because you were so darn lazy that you didn't bother to give a job. And God, because he's created you, gave you the ability to work so that you can provide for yourself. He provides you with employment, and then you in turn, through your labor, you provide for yourself and for your family. So we cannot, take a look at those words and say, well, you just don't have to worry about anything. Do absolutely nothing. Don't lock your doors. Don't be armed. Don't try and resist somebody who comes to do you harm because God's going to take care of you. I guarantee you everybody who has had that philosophy towards an imminent threat and did absolutely nothing, they either ended up injured or dead.
And those birds of the field that Jesus refers to, they don't sit around and do nothing and just expect to be fed. They gather and they build nests and that sort of thing. So when Jesus is referring to those animals as being provided for by God, he's talking about the means that by which they are providing for themselves.
Right. Absolutely.
Gotcha.
Absolutely. God gives us the means, but he's not going to sit there and go to work for us and clock in and earn our paycheck on our behalf.
Right.
And if you think that way, you may as well turn this show off now because you probably do not have the mental capacity to comprehend anything we're saying.
Well, the next two questions are a bit more vexing and should provide some interesting thought and conversation here. These are more about the question of the existence of evil and why things happen. The first would be we hear this by those who are maybe weak in the faith or who are doubting because of difficult times. They might say, well, God promises to protect us from evil. Why do some people fall victim to evil? Why do bad things happen to good people? And if you look at Luther's explanation in the Large Catechism, he talks about how he daily protects and defends us against all evil and misfortune, turning aside danger and mishap of every sort. And then later he says we should remind ourselves every time that we escape from distress or danger, we should realize that this is a gift and act of God. So how do we answer that question when people raise it? Well, if God promises to protect us, why do good people fall victim to evil acts?
I bet Job asked himself that same question a lot.
Probably.
And, I've pointed this out on numerous occasions, that God's provision, his steadfast promise to us, is to deliver us from eternal evil. Yes, he promises protection in this life, but that isn't an absolute. And what I mean by that, I'm not saying that God somehow is impotent in that regard, but that God, he must allow the consequences of sin to remain. And so we live in a fallen world, and because we live in a fallen world, we endure the consequences of sin. Now, that isn't terribly comforting to somebody who's, lying in a hospital bed because they've just been, stabbed nearly to death by an intruder. This just happened because of sin. No, that's. I encourage you that if you ever find yourself comforting somebody in that situation, don't let that be your lead-off sentence.
Right.
You're going to sound like an insensitive jerk. But looking at it from a theological perspective, we are told in the scriptures, for example, that God chastens those whom he loves. Well, what does God mean by that? Well, when we are enduring hardship in our life, those who are of the Christian faith, where is the one place they turn to first more often than not? They turn to God in prayer. They read the scriptures. As they are enduring tribulation, their faith is often strengthened. For those who are not of the Christian faith, this is one of those questions that is often asked by those who are either weak in their faith or insincere in their faith. Well, God, if he really was such a good guy, this wouldn't be happening to me because God's good and this isn't, whatever it is that I am going through.
Mm-hmm.
If that's your perspective, you're treating God as some sort of magical talisman that, well, if I just have faith in God, that he'll deliver me, I've got nothing to worry about. Yeah, that's not how it works.
And when we hear whenever one of these mass shootings happens and sort of the snarky leftists who respond to the thoughts and prayers, the tweets or social media comments about, our thoughts and prayers being with the victims, the snarky left will inevitably respond, well, your thoughts and prayers did a whole lot of good because it didn't stop this, whatever this terrible tragedy was. But that's not the way it works. We're praying for comfort because we know these bad things are going to happen in this world. We don't believe that just by being Christian and just by praying that bad things are never going to happen to us.
Right.
There was an image I saw. I think it was on one of the Lutheran Facebook groups that somebody shared that they just kind of loved this imagery, and it was a really neat painting, and I thought of it because it tied into this as I was thinking about what we were going to discuss today, and it was the image of the guardian angel, the idea, the young child in his bed asleep, and at the foot of the bed is the angel in all of his glory with his sword defending against danger. Where does the idea, the concept of the guardian angel and the protection of angels come from? In terms of, is there a biblical reference to this? Where does that idea originate?
In Psalm 91, we find these words: "Because you have made the Lord, who is my refuge, even the Most High, your dwelling place, no evil shall befall you, nor shall any plague come near your dwelling, for he shall give his angels charge over you, to keep you in all your ways. In their hands they shall bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone." So we have this imagery here of our Father in heaven commanding his angels to watch over us, to guard and protect us. Now, this doesn't mean that we are somehow impervious to evil, that we are somehow impervious to injury and death. But it does mean that our Father in heaven actually cares what happens to us. Mm-hmm. Our Father in heaven does not take joy in seeing us endure sufferings. So even if we do happen to endure sufferings, he is there to comfort us. And this is in itself a comforting thing, that our God actually commands his angels to be with us. We don't, as Lutherans, we aren't, maybe it's our German heritage that we aren't as, touchy and feely as other denominations. We don't have a strong emphasis on the work of guardian angels, even though we do have strong biblical references like this. But if something happens to us, that doesn't mean, our guardian angel was, on a coffee break or something, that that somehow, maybe we had sinned earlier in the day and God was a little displeased with us. So he said, for today, you're on your own. That's not how our God works. But he still has to allow the consequences of sin to remain. I mentioned earlier the example of Job. You look at Job and the great suffering that he went through, including the death of his children, the loss of his flocks. Of course, that pales in comparison to the death of your children. And yet, all of these things God permitted to happen. Mm-hmm. And what was the purpose for this? In the end, it was that God would be glorified. Now, speaking in these terms, I'm starting to sound, like a Calvinist, that somehow God, he punishes us for his own glory, which that's not how our God works. But because of sin, that God does permit difficulties to come into our lives, whether that is pain and suffering, that the afflictions of our relationships and so forth. Because God is a just God, he does allow us to endure the sufferings brought about by sin. But because our God is a loving God, and this gets back to the whole thing, well, if God's so good, why does he allow bad things to happen to good people? Look at Jesus on the cross, the Son of God, who endures all of our suffering, who endures the penalty for all of our sin, all of our shame, all of our disobedience against God. If God isn't the best guy in the world because, you've had a bad day and somehow that makes God a jerk in your mind, you look at the cross of Christ. That is where you see how much our God loves you and cares for you, because even though as a just God he must allow the penalty for sin to remain in this world, the temporal punishment, he has delivered you from the eternal punishment through his Son. One of the most comforting chapters within the New Testament, outside of the Gospels, where we have Jesus revealed to us as the Son of God who suffers and dies and rises again for our salvation. We have Romans chapter 8, where Paul talks about the sufferings in this life. And then he says that the sufferings of this present life are nothing compared to the glory that is yet to be revealed to us. And that is just so comforting to someone who is enduring suffering, that guess what? You have the promise that it gets better than this, that this is the worst your life is going to be, is the sufferings that you are enduring. Right. And compared to an eternity with Christ and all the saints in glory, it is nothing to be compared to that. Two of my favorite Psalms are Psalm 46 and Psalm 56. In Psalm 46, as the psalmist reflects on the sufferings of this life, as he reflects on the calamity that we see in creation and wars and all that sort of thing, he says, "Be still and know that I am God." That when we are enduring affliction in our life, we are directed not at our own affliction, not at ourselves, but we are directed to look at our God who has promised us eternal deliverance. Be still and know that I am God. Reflect on who I am as your God who has redeemed you. And then in Psalm 56, and again, this is a psalm that reflects on sufferings. And the psalmist says, "Put my tears into your bottle. Are they not in your book?" That our God, he sees our sufferings. And then the psalmist says, "This I know that God is for me." That our God is for us and for our salvation, and he has delivered his Son unto death for us. Our God is for us. Therefore, let us rejoice when we endure sufferings, that our God in his mercy, because he loves us, did not desire us to suffer eternally, to suffer. And let's face it, the eternal sufferings that is reserved for the devil and his angels and those who despise the Son of God, it's beyond our imagination. There is nothing in this life that we can properly relate to the kinds of sufferings that are in the depths of hell. Right. Because it's not just physical suffering, it's the spiritual suffering of eternal separation from God. And yet we look at the example of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, that it's suggested, the implication is there, that those who are suffering in hell are able to see the bliss of heaven but cannot attain it. Think about that for a minute.
Yeah. So as we sort of wrap things up, that answers, I think, the last question, and I think the most thorny is, of course, and I don't know whether this is, some will say, well, this is the reason that they have a hard time believing, or maybe they just use this as an excuse for not believing because they just don't want to in the first place. the idea that, why would a loving God allow evil to exist in the first place?
Right, and that all comes back to if you doubt the love of God, then you are not properly looking at Christ and his cross.
Right.
Because that is where we see the love of God demonstrated. The truth is that none of us are perfect. Not only, there are some denominations that do not have a strong doctrine on original sin. I get that. We can discuss this even apart from that if you have committed just one sin in your life,
Mm-hmm.
even if it was an impure thought about someone else, an angry thought about someone else, thoughts of violence, if you rejoiced, and this is going to sound very strange, but if we understand our doctrine properly, where Christ tells us to love our enemies, if you reveled in the death of al-Baghdadi and you were gleeful that he was blown to bits and is suffering in hell, that's a sin.
Right.
Whether or not we want to admit it, that is a sin, that the sinful nature desires the suffering of our enemies.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, if we understand our theology properly, our proper response is to mourn the death of someone who was created in the image of God, but was so evil in their life that they are now suffering in hell. We should mourn their eternal death, their eternal sufferings in hell. So, for what it's worth, if you're saying, hey, God must be a real jerk because this happened to me, God did not desire you to suffer. That suffering was brought about by Satan, who is the author of sin and suffering and death. And he is the one who rejoices in your misery, not our God who loves you and desires your good.
Right. So sum up real quick, just to wrap this up, when Luther explains that God defends me against all danger and guards and protects me from all evil, how does that work itself out? How do we think about that in light of the Second Amendment, in light of gun rights, and the natural, as we talk about it, the natural right of self-defense?
Well, our God has given us, as I mentioned near the beginning of this episode, God has given us the ability to have a rational mind. And when he says that God defends us against all danger and guards and protects us from all evil, we can understand that in two ways. First, in a temporal way, that God does care for us, and he does desire to protect us in this life. Yet, that protection isn't absolute because of the fallenness of this creation and the consequences of sin that cannot be erased until Christ returns in judgment to bring all creation to an end and to bring the faithful into everlasting life and to proclaim judgment on those who have rejected him. So we cannot say that, well, if this article is true, every single one of the articles of the Creed, Luther closes with the words, "This is most certainly true." Well, how can this certainly be true when we see that there are even Christians who suffer? That brings us to the second way that we are defended against all danger and so forth. That, as the Psalms also speak of our God, for example, in Psalm 27, it talks about God preserving our life and so forth. Yet everybody dies, right?
Right.
So we understand it in an eternal sense, that our Father in heaven delivers us from everlasting evil through his Son, Jesus Christ. That our Father in heaven grants us eternal security in his kingdom. And that it is, while we live in this life, we have a kind of a now and not yet reality. We have the blessings of being children of the Father and heirs of everlasting life right now in this life, but we have it in an imperfect sense that is not to be realized unto us until we enter into everlasting glory. And so, to kind of wrap this all up, when it comes to the Second Amendment, because after all, this is Armed Lutheran Radio, and we should bring that into it, that God does bless us with the ability to act on behalf of ourselves and our loved ones to protect us. He doesn't sit there. God doesn't sit there. Sorry, mush mouth again. God doesn't get upset at us when we say, well, I'm going to have to do something right now at this minute because there's a bad guy at the door ready to break in my door. And, God's not going to be upset with you if you say, okay, I must act, rather than saying, I'm just going to sit on my backside and wait for God to do something for me. If any of our listeners take that approach, if I'm within driving distance, I will happily attend your funeral. I say that in all sarcasm, of course. But yes, God has given us the means to defend ourselves. And if we, I don't want to go to the extent that some would say, like that chucklehead Steve Anderson.
Right.
You got to get yourself a gun, at least 2 of them.
Yeah.
But God does not want us to act as if there's nothing that we can do for ourselves, that we have to sit there and do nothing because it is His job to take care of us.
Right. All right. I think that...
Before we conclude, a perfect example of this that we have from Scripture is in Matthew's Gospel with the flight to Egypt. When Herod is sending his thugs to come slaughter the baby boys in Bethlehem, and God warns Joseph of this in a dream, Joseph doesn't sit there and say, well, God's going to protect me. I'm just going to wait it out and chill because, God says He's going to take care of us. No, Joseph takes his family and flees. Even though it is the God who warns Joseph takes the action necessary to protect his family. We also should follow that same example. We have the abilities, we recognize the danger, we act responsively.
Or the story of Abram and when his family is captured and he doesn't sit back and say, well, the Lord will take care of it. He rounds up members of the family and they arm up and they go track down the captors and free his family from their kidnappers. So Abram didn't, going back even to the early part of the Old Testament, Abram doesn't sit back and say, well, God will provide.
Right.
All right. Well, I think that covers it fairly well. I appreciate you doing this with so little warning, and I just gave you a very brief outline of what we would discuss and figured, okay, we'll see where this goes.
One of these days, you'll have to release an entirely unedited episode, and
so
everyone will just say, these guys really are amateurs, aren't they?
It's amazing what editing can do.
That's right. It can make even the most amateur of hosts sound like a professional, right?
That's right. Well, thank you.
And I'm not insulting you in that. I'm insulting myself.
No, I took no offense. I completely agree. As the person who does all the editing, and I hear all of my mistakes, so I completely agree with you. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Hey, absolutely. It was a joy.
Folks, if you have any comments or any questions about anything you heard here today or a suggestion for a future topic, please visit our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback. Send us a voicemail or a voice message or an email. We'd love to hear from you and respond to you directly or on the show. Be sure to tune in next week. We'll have another variety show with tips from the entire cast. And thanks again, Pastor, for filling in last week and for all of the guests who filled in and made last week possible. So until next week, keep shooting, keep praying. We'll talk to you next time.
John Bennett is the pastor at St. John's Lutheran Church in Willow Creek, Minnesota. For more information, visit stjohnswillowcreek.org. For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.us. Check out the Facebook page, The Armed Lutheran, or join our Facebook group, Fans of Armed Lutheran Radio. If you like what you hear, please leave us a comment on our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback or a review on iTunes and let us know what you think. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio, a member of the Self-Defense Radio Network.